the best question to ask any Israeli. What would you have done if you would have been born Palestinian? But the problem is that most of the Israelis cannot imagine themselves being born a Palestinian. There are two options right now. Either Israel continues to be an apartheid state, or Israel and Palestine are turning into a democracy.
Peace be upon you, and welcome to episode 4 of Let's Review. And in the last few podcasts, we've been speaking to religious figures. We've been speaking to rabbis from Jerusalem, rabbis from New York, rabbis from here in London, Stamford Hill, one of the largest communities. And we've had some fascinating discussions back and forth from opposing views regarding the religious justification or not justification of the response of the Israeli government and what's happening in Gaza. And we left off in the last episode where Rabbi Elhanan Beck spoke very powerfully as a religious Jew, saying that our voices are not being heard. We are not just few in number, but you can go to many different places around the world where there are strong Jewish communities who are speaking against these actions, but their voices aren't being conveyed in the mainstream media. And this actually segues beautifully into this episode where we have a very special guest with us today. And today, moving away from strictly religious figures, we're going into the field of journalism. And I'm delighted to have with us a really, really special guest who I'm privileged to have with us. This guest is one of the top journalists in Israel. In fact, in 2021, he won one of Israel's top awards for journalism, the Sokolov Award. He's been in the field for many decades, and he's been working for the Haaretz newspaper as a senior member of the newspaper. And he is a prolific journalist who's also worked on TV, and he's none other than Gideon Levy, who's joining us today, who you may have seen across social media on different channels. He's been on the Oxford Union debate and so forth. So Gideon's joining us today from Israel. Gideon, it's a pleasure to have you today. Hello.
It's a pleasure being with you. Thank you.
Gideon, I have a lot to ask you, and you've been answering a lot of questions on social media, but a lot of it's almost surreal and confusing, you know. On the one side, as I mentioned, more and more voices are speaking out. Some are faint, some are stronger, and saying that most sincere people will say that, of course, what happened on October 7th was completely wrong. Nobody condones the killing of innocent people of any type. We all condemn that, of course. But the response of the Israeli government to now they're saying almost 85% of the people are displaced in Gaza, and the amount of children, women and innocent people have killed, the infrastructure has been destroyed. Can you explain from a journalistic point of view that so many people in the world are now speaking out saying this is wrong, yet this is continuing? In fact, recently the Israeli government have been saying they're going to escalate it even further until 3 conditions are met. So how come we have this disparity that more and more voices speaking out, yet the actions are escalating and saying that we will go in further and destroy even more of Gaza to reach our objectives? How do we reconcile these two different things?
More and more people are speaking out, but only overseas, not in Israel. In Israel, there is almost a wall-to-wall support in this war. I don't remember one single war in which there was no opposition, no resistance, no critic. And that's very dangerous for Israel. But in Israel, the support is, as I said, very, very wide. And Israelis had built themselves their own rationale for their way of thinking. Namely, in any case, the world is anti-Semite. In any case, the world is against us, whatever we do. And we should ignore the world. For sure, if the world is just talking and not taking any actions, don't forget that when you speak about speaking out, people speaking out, 2-3 weeks after Russia invaded the Crimea, there were sanctions. With Israel, nobody even dared to mention the word sanctions. So Israel learned to live with all those condemnations. It's not very pleasant, but it's also not so unbearable. And if you tell yourself, we are right, you are wrong, you hate us, you are anti-Semitic, then you live in peace. And above all, don't forget that in Israel, people hardly see the images of Gaza. People hardly see what's going on in Gaza. I would say that any average Brit so more from Gaza than any average Israeli. It's unbelievable how the media is avoiding us. No images, no suffer, no sacrifice, no thousands of killed children. I mean, all those things are mentioned, obviously, but if you don't show the images, you don't feel it, you don't understand the scale of this catastrophe. So altogether, the world can protest. Israel will go on, I'm afraid.
But isn't it the case that even abroad, we have an example of a German footballer who spoke in favor of, in the Bundesliga for Palestine. He was removed or sanctioned. There was an actress, I believe a Mexican or Latino actress, who spoke in favor of Palestine, and her role was, she was a prominent actress. And there were other examples of people abroad who were removed from jobs, or, you know, for various different things. They were also somehow suppressed. So how do we face that even abroad? How do we effectively speak in favor or against atrocities when you are labeled either anti-Semitic, or you are labeled, as you said, there's a double standard between what happened in Russia and Ukraine and here. So how do we effectively abroad manage that when more and more the narrative is being said as if you cannot speak against this?
This starts to become a problem of freedom of speech in many countries all over the world. Criminalizing critics of Israel, labeling them as anti-Semites, is a very shrewd and cynical mean of the Israeli and Jewish propaganda all over the world to avoid those voices. And it is extremely efficient and extremely successful. Europe is totally paralyzed. Even in the United States, in certain states, it's almost a crime to support BDS, for example. And that's really a problem of freedom of speech that you guys in all the communities should fight for. It's even not fighting for the Palestinians. It's fighting for freedom of speech. It's fighting for having the right to express yourself. And it's fighting and struggling for justice. I don't remember one case in which solidarity with beaten people is illegitimate. I don't remember such a case except of fear. And you shouldn't surrender and shouldn't give up and shouldn't play along those rules.
Gideon, how about, you know, it might be an ignorant question, but yourself, you're in Israel and you're apparently allowed to or enabled to speak out against it. So how is that possible? Or do you also face difficulties yourself?
No, I don't face any difficulties when it comes with the government, with the army, with the Secret Service. I have full freedom of speech, namely because I'm a privileged Jew who writes to a very respected newspaper, and I must emphasize Israel is still a liberal democracy for its Jewish citizens, and as such, I have no problem. If I have problems, it's with the street, with people who threaten me, with people who send me all kinds of emails, but it's really not, I cannot complain. I'm really not the story, but I must emphasize that I have full freedom of speech.
Gideon, if you can just explain, because for many people, the way that when this conflict started, even for many people in the world, they're not familiar with the whole situation. When you hear it says that before October 7th, which of course we condemn in no uncertain terms what happened, but they say that before this, the Israelis were not in Gaza, they had left Gaza and left Palestinians free to live. And also some people, they show images of beautiful pictures of Gaza, luxurious areas, and the image they try to give is a very good life, free life. And so what is the problem now? And that they were offered these freedoms and solutions. So can you describe, if we go back before, decades before, many people, as I said, there's this conflict, the way it's blown up on social media, they're not aware of the history. How can you describe, what is the issue? How are Palestinians and people in Gaza living, to explain to people who are seeing these things for the first time?
You see, there are two kinds of prisons in the world. One is the traditional one in which the guards are inside the prison guarding the prisoners from within the prison. The other prison is a prison in which the guards don't get into the prison at all, and they are just guarding it from the outside. None of those prisons stop being a prison. They are both prisons because people cannot get out of those prisons. This is Gaza. Until 2005, Gaza was occupied by Israel, like the West Bank is occupied by Israel. And there were settlements, Jewish settlements, like they are in the West Bank, just less. And in 2005, we had a courageous prime minister who decided to withdraw from the Gaza Strip. But he did it in a one-sided way, not in an agreement with the Palestinians, in a very arrogant, one-sided way. And apparently, it came out that he just changed the rules of the prison for the benefit of Israel. The prisoner, the guard, will sit from now on from the outside, and Gaza turned into the biggest cage in the world. We evacuated the settlements, which was something very positive. The Israeli army went out from Gaza, but Gaza remained a cage. And in the last 16 years, Gaza is a cage. And anyone who thinks that in a cage, human beings will turn into peaceful people, relaxed, happy, and friendly, doesn't understand anything in psychology, in sociology, in human behavior. You cannot live in a cage and be happy or be peaceful or lose your dreams for freedom, not fight for them, not struggle for them. Not always the struggle is a legitimate one. Not always the struggle is a kind one or a nice one. Many times it's very brutal and very, very ugly, like it was on the 7th of October. But the cage remains a cage.
But Gideon, can you give some specific examples? Like when you say that it's a cage and it's a prison, were people not allowed to go out freely, or what kind of things were not allowed inside? What kind of aspects of life were controlled? Can you give some sense? Because, as I said, the majority of people in the world are ignorant of this. They're not aware. So what specific individual examples can you give to reflect what you just said, the fact that it's a prison without guards?
It would be much easier to speak and shorter to speak about the things they could have done. Nothing. You cannot get out. Gaza is surrounded from most of its directions by Israel. In the south, it is surrounded by Egypt. And in the west, there is the sea. Egypt, this must be mentioned here, participated in the siege over Gaza and is a full partner to the siege from any moral or political point of view, and we shouldn't forget that Egypt is a partner to this inhuman criminal siege, but mostly it is Israel, which doesn't let anyone in or out, except of very exceptional cases. Israelis are not allowed into Gaza. People of Gaza are not even allowed to their relatives in the West Bank. You know, it's one people. It's 1 hour drive from Gaza to the West Bank. Same people, families. No one from Gaza can go to the West Bank to visit his friends, to study in the West Bank, to study in the West, to study in the East. Nothing and nothing. Only very, very few can leave Gaza. In the same time, the products that are getting into Gaza and getting out of Gaza are limited and controlled by Israel, that Israel can decide what will be allowed and what will not be allowed into Gaza. And we don't talk about weapons now. We talk many times about pasta. We talk many times about daily products that for certain times are allowed and that they are not allowed. Electricity is in a terrible shape in Gaza because Israel is not supporting any construction of new power stations, and there is shortage of gasoline. I mean, you name it. But above all, to be a young man or woman in Gaza, to be born into this reality is the most depressing thing you can think about, because even if you go to university, even if you study, even if you do anything possible to build yourself a career, when you cannot get out, your life is doomed. You have no chance you have no perspective for your life. The whole Gaza is tiny. You cannot go out. It's really claustrophobic. Claustrophobic psychologically and claustrophobic also physically.
Gideon, so two questions based on that. Since when is this the case? Is it since 1948-47 or afterwards? And number two, what is the reasoning or philosophy behind doing this to the people in Gaza for so long? So when has this been from, and why are they doing this? What's their reasoning for doing this to the people of Gaza?
The siege started in 2005 when the disengagement took place, namely when Israel had pulled out from Gaza. The motivation, there is a formal justification that this is because of security, that we want to demilitarize Gaza, which totally failed, by the way, because Gaza has a lot of weapons smuggled in through the tunnels. But the hidden reason is really to disconnect Gaza from the West Bank, to disconnect Hamas from the Fatah, and to create a situation in which the Palestinian people is falling apart, is not united. And then you can claim that you don't have a partner for peace because they are not united. And then it's very easy to continue the occupation. So by the end of the day, the raison d'etre of the siege is maintaining the occupation.
So, Gideon, if we go a bit further back, often what you hear in the media by different spokespeople from Israel is that Palestinians a number of times were offered two-state solutions, but they did not take those solutions, whether it's the Oslo Accords or even in 1948, they said it was a very fair division. You may be aware in 1948, the foreign minister of Pakistan, Sir Zafrullah Khan, he was a member of the Ahmadiyya community. He was saying that although they've given this so-called two-state solution, there were so many disadvantages to the Arabs or the Palestinians. For example, most of the land that could be cultivated was given to the Jewish side. Much of the strategic side was given to the Jewish side. Many of the resources, other things. So it wasn't a fair division. But from your knowledge, when it often is said again and again that Palestinians were offered these solutions but they didn't accept it, what is the reality of that?
The matter of fact is that the Palestinians were never offered a just solution. They were never offered a solution which will recognize them equally like the Jews in Israel, like the Jews in Israel and Palestine. They were never offered a fair offer. They did their mistakes, the Palestinians. I think that refusing to the partition plan that you just mentioned here before the creation of the State of Israel was a mistake, even though I think that even if the Palestinians would have agreed to the partition plan, as it was then, Israel wouldn't live in peace with it, and sooner or later, Israel would conquer more territory. I have no doubts about it, because Israel was too small according to the partition plan. But in any case, ever since then, there was never a serious offer to create a Palestinian state which is an equal state to Israel, with the same rights, the same sovereign rights, same sovereignty, even the notion that the Palestinian state should be demilitarized. Why should it? Why can Israel be holding any possible weapon in the world, claiming that it is only for self-protection and the Palestinians have no right for self-protection? Who is going to protect them exactly? But let's put it aside. It just shows you the way of thinking. That the Palestinians should be happy about the Bantustan. Surprise, surprise, the Palestinians said no to a Bantustan.
Gideon, also, I mentioned that I've interviewed many senior rabbis from different countries, and they said to me that, before the creation of State of Israel, we were living very peacefully, Muslims, Christians, Jews. We used to babysit each other's children, and there was no issues between these religions, and therefore they described this is not a religious conflict, Rather, it's a geopolitical conflict to do with, political gains. Would you agree with this or disagree with this?
It is a national dispute, a political dispute, a dispute over a piece of land, a dispute over rights, and it's turning into a religious dispute as well. I'm very afraid because once religion will be in it, it will be much harder to storm it. And you see tendencies in both sides, by the way, among the Jewish Israelis and among the Palestinians. Stronger and stronger religious motivations and arguments, which will make it much harder to be solved.
So Gideon, something I saw you, and it's been going viral on social media, that I want to ask you about, is that you mentioned that there's 2 or 3 points that you've analyzed which allows Israel to act in the way that it does. I think you know what I'm referring to. I think it was a speech from 2015. If we can very quickly just go over that. I think number 1, if you remind me, you said that people in Israel believe they are the chosen people. Is that right? Is that the first point that you mentioned? And if you can just describe that, what do you mean by that? What effect does it have on what we're seeing right now?
I was thinking about 3 values that we Israelis are being born and grown ups under the shade of those values, under the influence of those values. We are being told again and again that we are the chosen people, and therefore we have the rights to do things that other peoples don't have. We are taught that we are the biggest victim in human history. And again, this leads us to the conclusion that being such huge victims, and the only real victims in human history, we have the right to do whatever we want. And the third one is that the Palestinians who live next to us are not really human beings like us, and therefore there is no problem of moral doubts, of human rights, because anyhow the Palestinians are born to kill. The only thing which motivates them is to push us to the ocean, and therefore again we have the right to do whatever we want.
Gideon, is it not very dangerous the way that certain language is being used, as we mentioned, to dehumanize this population? And in a way, doesn't that make it easier to justify almost an erasure, or not an erasure of the population, but the way that the whole of Gaza is being put to rubble? 85% are displaced. How does this language and narrative, like I know you've also served in the IDF a long time ago as well, how do people reconcile now with over 20,000 people killed, more than 8, 9, 10,000 children, women? Does that, although you said in Israel people aren't really aware of what's going on fully because it's kind of not blocked, but that narrative is not pushed everywhere, is there not a conscious that so many people are dying who have no link, no direct engagement? They're not directly trying to harm Israel as such. Does that collective conscious not come in play to those soldiers, to those other people who are going in and flattening an entire population? That, how does that dehumanization and language, feed into that?
The dehumanization is a very vital tool to maintain the occupation. If you don't dehumanize the Palestinians, then you can't do them what you are doing. You can't treat them the way you treat them. You can't hold them in such a brutal way, and you can't oppress them in such a brutal way. So dehumanization is a tool to live in peace without having too many question marks. Saying about the explanation to this war. First of all, one should realize that what happened on the 7th of October was horrible, was barbaric. Really, I've been to those kibbutzim and villages, and I saw what happened there 1-2 days after it happened. It was horrifying. It was horrible. And it gave Israel a reason to attack Gaza, no doubt. Israel had a reason to attack Gaza. The question is, was it clever to attack it? And above all, is it human, moral, and legal to attack Gaza the way that Israel is attacking it? But you can't ignore the fact that something happened on the 7th. And Israelis are using it to justify everything that the IDF is doing. Most of the Israelis believe that after the 7th, with all the terrible crimes that took place in the 7th, Israel has the right to go wild. I don't share it, but that's the popular sentiment in Israel.
So Gideon, continuing on from that, what I wanted to know is that coming on to the current times, again, as a journalist, it's all a battle of social media. We keep hearing different narratives. So even the figures which are used by established news sites, whether it's BBC or Washington Post, the Israeli side often question it, say, we don't think that many people have been killed. These are not official figures. And on the other side, they say, well, in the past, these figures have come true, or they don't give any counter figures. So this kind of war of social media, even outside of Israel, is waging ferociously. One person puts a clip, and then another person says this clip is from some other time. How you as a journalist are seeing this kind of, they say the first casualty in war is the truth. So what do you feel has been the casualty in truth in terms of the rights of the Palestinian people and the truth that's happening there? How would you describe it?
First of all, I want to be very clear. There were question marks and doubts from both sides. The radical left in Europe and in the United States and some Arab states put some doubts about what happened on the 7th. And there are all kind of conspiracy theories about what happened on the 7th. I suggest not to put the doubts, even though there were some cases on the 7th in which Israeli soldiers got hostages, in which Israel may be exaggerated in one or two details, but no, maybe even one cannibal incident. But don't put doubts about what happened on the 7th. It was horrible. Same I say on the other side. Look, figures are not very precise right now because there are still many people under the rubble. There is chaos in Gaza. So let's say that the figure, which is updated now, that there are 22,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza, let's say they exaggerated in 10%, and there were only 20,000. 20%, there were only 18,000. Does it really matter? So let's put aside all those back noises of having doubts here and having doubts there. They are very, very, very clear facts. And the fact is that there is a mass killing in Gaza, and the fact is that there was a barbaric attack on the south of Israel. Those facts cannot be denied and shouldn't be denied.
And I would just want to add, for the sake of our viewers, we covered this extensively in previous podcasts. We had some imams on that in Islam, the killing of innocent women, children, elderly, religious figures, those who are not involved in combat, is strictly forbidden in Islam and by the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing of Allah be upon him. So we've made this very clear in our previous episodes as well. And for those who may be watching this new, you can go back and watch those episodes where it has been explained according to the scriptures. So Gideon, my question then is that what is the end game then? Because, what is the end game in terms of what you feel the strategy of Israel is in Gaza? Like you said, if someone's attacked, of course they have a right to reply. But sometimes the strategy seems a bit not effective on the surface. Like if you're announcing that we're going to bomb a certain building, naturally everyone's going to leave there, including the criminals. They will not want to stay there, or and so on and so forth. And also, like you said, the whole infrastructure is destroyed. So what do people have to come back? Thirdly, when you're telling people to move, many people are reporting they don't have anywhere to move. We interviewed people in Gaza who said they moved 5 times in 30 days. They don't know where else to move. Sometimes when they move, there's wrong information or difficult information. They don't have internet, they have communication, they're bombed there. So what do you feel is the end strategy? Like you said, fine, people have a right to reply for argument's sake. But what is the end strategy? What can they achieve through the strategy? And what is the end game?
There is none. And that's the problem. And I keep on saying it's from day one. There is no end game plan. And therefore this war is so criminal. Because the longer it takes, the more you realize that the goals that Israel declared are not achievable and will not be fully achieved. No doubts about it. But even if those goals would have been achieved, what happens then? Let's say Israel is crashing Hamas. No more Hamas in the world. And then what happens then? Who is going to replace Hamas? So the problem is that Israel went to this war mainly motivated by the need to take revenge, to punish, which I totally understand. It's human. After such an attack, I can understand it. But that's not a policy. And for sure not a policy that leads you to anywhere. You can ask very simple. After almost 3 months of fighting, after this mass killing, is Israel today in a better position than 3 months ago? And my answer is no.
So would you say that, while we're saying that, of course, everyone has a right to defense, we know that, and we've covered it, that it's completely wrong to target innocent people. When we're talking about proportionality, is the response completely disproportionate, what you're saying?
How else can you present it? I mean, killing 8,000 children. Is there a question at all of proportionality? 8,000 children, and we didn't stop yet. I heard that last week there was one day in which 160 babies were killed in one day. What proportionality? I mean, what in the world can justify this? What can make it legal or legitimate? What? There is nothing like this.
One thing that the Israelis, you heard the spokespeople saying, is that if you compare, by the end of this, when you compare the ratio of deaths, civilians to combatants compared to previous wars, Iraq, this will be far better. However, it seems like on the graphs that we see, the amount of people who've been killed in a short time is one of the greatest deaths in a short time in any modern conflict. But I'm not a I'm a kind of journalist, but you're a journalist in Israel. But what would you say about this statement that is often made?
First of all, even if you compare it to other wars, we are in a very bad position. You can compare it to Ukraine, less civilians, less children killed. You can compare it to Iraq and Afghanistan. It's even comparing doesn't make any good service to Israel. But above all, why should we compare it all? For God's sake. Is it horrible? Yes, it is. Is it unprecedented in Palestine? Yes, it is unprecedented. I heard today Mahmoud Abbas say that it is worse than the Nakba. And in many ways, it is worse than the Nakba. For sure, in terms of casualties and destruction. So why should we compare it all? I mean, I don't need comparisons. There are certain things which are absolute illegal, absolute criminal, absolute heartbreaking without comparing it to any other reality.
And Gideon, one thing you said in that speech in 2015 that's going viral, I wanted to ask you what you meant further by it. You were saying that something on the lines of that there's been many occupiers in history, but you were saying there's something unique about this type of occupation. Can you just explain that? For many people wouldn't have heard what you said and what you meant by this.
There were many occupations in history, but never was there an occupation in which the occupier claims that he's the victim. That the occupier claims that he's occupying because he has no other choice, because he's being forced to occupy, because he's forced to govern another people by force in a very brutal way. That's again, we are getting to what we spoke in the first part of our conversation, this way of Israelis building themselves a whole world of justifications to everything, which is totally disconnected from reality.
So what incentive will Israel have to change? Where you're saying that they believe they're the chosen people, they don't. Most people in Israel, that's the government side, the public, they don't really know exactly what's going on in the sense that there's a certain narrative being pumped out. So what incentive will Israel have to change? Are we just going to see a worse and worse situation now?
There's only one incentive that can influence, and unfortunately, this incentive doesn't exist, or still doesn't exist. And that's a real pressure from the international community. That's the only way. Don't expect Israel to change by itself. Don't expect the Israelis waking up one morning and say, let's put an end to all this. It's not good. It will happen only if Israelis will pay and be punished and be taken accountable for what is happening. And this can only a very effective international community do. The international community knew very well what to do vis-a-vis the apartheid system in South Africa. And it's only because, or maybe not only, but mainly because of the international intervention that we don't have apartheid anymore in South Africa. Same is valid about Israel and Palestine. But unfortunately, when it comes to Israel, even mentioning actions against Israel, boycott, you name it, become a crime, become not legitimate. So we are very far from achieving this change.
So I have to say also, in the interest of fairness, it's apart from international Western leaders who are showing double standards, Russia, Ukraine here, it's also Arab nations, right? They are saying things, but they're not also taking effective measures. Why do you think that is, that there's also Arab nations as well as Western nations who are not really taking measures to stop this tragedy continuing to take place?
Interests and interests and interests. And the Palestinians don't serve out of the regimes in the Middle East. And everyone pays lip service to the Palestinians, but almost no one is doing anything for them, for their rights. I think that the Palestinians, at least until this war, were in their lowest point ever, because they really lost all support. The world lost interest. The world had other issues to deal with. They were totally lacking leadership, divided. And above all, the Arab world totally abandoned them. And they did so because the interest of, I was in Dubai and I met the foreign minister of Dubai 2 years ago. And he told me, we don't feel like being taken hostage by the Palestinians. We had them so many years. They never appreciated it. And we don't want to be taken hostage. We have also our own agenda. And our priorities, our own interests. And therefore we make peace with Israel. So it's one thing, the lip service, and the other thing are the interests. And the world realized that the interests are stronger than justice and stronger than solidarity.
My final two kind of overarching questions, Gideon, is it's been very fascinating speaking to you. One relates to, I know you've spoken to very senior people, former prime ministers of Israel, and I know you mentioned once you spoke to one of the former prime ministers and asked him about if he was born Palestinian. Could you recount this kind of conversation if you're comfortable to, and why you asked that and what the response was and what the inference or lesson we can learn from that?
Yeah, that's a good point. In 1998, I interviewed Ehud Barak, then a candidate for prime minister. He was not yet prime minister. He was shortly after he elected to prime minister. And I asked him the question that I used to ask almost every Israeli. What would have happened if you would have been born Palestinian? How would you conduct your life? Would you collaborate? Wouldn't you struggle? Wouldn't you resist? And Ehud Barak was honest enough. Then he regretted it, but because he paid a political price for his honest answer. But then he was new in politics, so he gave the only honest answer that he could give. Namely, I would have joined one of the terror organizations. He is a warrior, he is a fighter, and this is what he would have done, obviously, to reach freedom to his people. And then it became a big scandal, obviously. But by the end of the day, that's the best question to ask any Israeli. What would you have done if you would have been born Palestinian? But the problem is that most of the Israelis cannot imagine themselves being born a Palestinian.
And also, Gideon, I heard something very interesting, which I think is very useful for you to kind of mention. Again, because people don't have that, going back to what we said before, people don't have that sense, like you've been to Gaza, West Bank. You mentioned a really interesting incident somewhere about how you saw the ambulance crossing somewhere and how it had to wait for some time while the Israeli soldiers were kind of playing in the back or something. Could you mention that incident here?
The point is that when I look backwards to the stories that I wrote in the early first Intifada, in the early 90s, and then in the 2000s and later, you see that basically nothing changed. It's the same policy. You refer to a story in which there was a severely wounded dying person in an ambulance, and the soldiers, they play Begamon in their tent and wouldn't even bother to get out to see what's going on with this ambulance. And the ambulance was waiting for, I think, over an hour, with giving all the possible signals to the soldiers that there is emergency. They wouldn't bother even to check the ambulance. Cases like this, I wrote so many times about women who lost their babies in checkpoints. But this was all long time ago, because then at least Israel were bothered when they heard those stories. Today they wouldn't even bother to read them.
But Gideon, when you said that you have traveled extensively Gaza, West Bank, but yet the people of Israel are not aware. When you go back to Israel, you write these articles. You're an award-winning journalist. People read your, you have the freedom because you mentioned you're Jewish from a privileged family. Are there people, good-natured people in Israel, who do listen to you and other people similar-minded to you and change their views and speak out against the government? Or is it difficult for them to do so? What's the perception of people like yourself and others who are getting the message out in Israel? How is that message received, and how is it influencing or not influencing people?
First of all, there was and there is a very meaningful group of devoted, courageous Israelis who are fighting for human rights and equality and justice and peace for many, many years. Part of them pay a price. Young people and old people. You see those scenes everywhere. You see Israelis guard Palestinian shepherds who are due to brutal attacks of the settlers. Last week, I was even in a community where Israeli retired people are sleeping with the shepherds in order to protect them. So those phenomena are all those years and are very touching. The problem is a double problem. First of all, they are very small in figures. And secondly, the media and the government and the public opinion, they legitimizes them. And they are presented as traitors and as anti-Semites and self-hating Jews and all those expressions. But this group exists. I must tell you that after the 7th of October, even this group shrinked dramatically. And this makes me very, very angry, sad, and frustrated.
So, Gideon, coming to my final question in terms of the solution going forward. People have said 2-state solution, 1-state solution. I know you've had certain views, but how do we now solve the issue? People have different ways of saying they will solve the issue. After the conflict is over, if we say that we're in times of peace, or even the way out from now, how do we solve this issue that's been going on for so long? 2-state, 1-state, what's your view?
First of all, we don't solve it. We don't have partners for solutions. Neither in Israel nor in Palestine, but I'm more concerned about Israel. In Israel, there is no statesman right now who has any intention or any courage to go for a solution. And therefore, we are really in one of the most pessimistic points in the history of Palestine and Israel, because I don't see anything moving. I don't see anyone taking this challenge, and we are farther than ever from a solution. On the other hand, one should remember that many times the unexpected is happening. I am very much in favor of the 2-state solution. It's a just solution. Two peoples share one piece of land. Let's share it. The only problem is that long time ago, this solution is not achievable. And it's either dead or was never alive, but it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant to speak today about the two-state solution where there are 700,000 settlers, Jewish settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, is being not connected to reality. In the maximum, it can turn into a Bantustan, as I said before. There is no room for an equal, viable Palestinian state. And if it's not an equal, viable Palestinian state, it's not a solution. So if it's not two states, it's only a one state. And when we speak about one state, let's remember we are living in a one state for 55 years now. The only problem is its regime. It's not a democracy, it's an apartheid state. So the only solution, in my view, is turning Israel and Palestine into a one democratic, secular state. It is possible, even though right now it's unthinkable, but we have at least to have a vision. We have at least to start talk about it. So maybe the next generation will be able to implement it. There are two options right now. Either Israel continues to be an apartheid state, or Israel and Palestine are turning into a democracy.
So finally, Gideon, is what message would you have now for people as an Israeli journalist who's been to West Bank, who's been to Gaza, who's in Israel, who's well familiar? What final message do you have going forward for people to have any semblance of hope, or how they can best, from your point of view, how they can best speak out or make an impact or make a difference in trying to stop the injustice in the right way?
I think there is a growing gap between governments in the West and public opinions. This gap must be overbridged. It's impossible that so many people around the world, so many of them, see the truth, understand that there is a horrible injustice for the Palestinian people, that it's unacceptable that in 2023 there's a people without citizenship, there's a people without any civil, national, or individual rights, and something must be done about it. It's also unacceptable that the state that runs the Palestinians, namely Israel, the state that governs the Palestinians, is still the darling of the West, of the governments of the West. So it's really a call for solidarity with the Palestinians, a call for understanding that only the world can save both the Palestinians and the Israelis.
Thank you. We promised you 1 hour, and we've gone just over an hour. So you've been very open-hearted, and you know, to have someone of your experience, an award-winning journalist, to speak to us, it's been an absolute pleasure. And I want to thank you for coming on our podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yes. And also, you know, before the podcast, I was speaking, I don't know if you're familiar with Muhammad Sharif Odeh. He's the head of our Ahmadiyya Muslim community in Haifa. We have our center there. Yes, so he also asked me to convey his salam, and he invites you to our center over there in Haifa whenever you have a chance. And on his behalf, I extend you that invitation.
Thank you very much. What is your background, if I may ask?
So my background, I'm the editor-in-chief of our magazine called The Review of Religions. And I'm also a translator or interpreter on our TV station called Muslim Television Ahmadiyya. So The Review of Religions, as I mentioned, is a 120-year-old publication published by the Ahmadiyya community.
And your personal background, where were you born?
I was born in London, in England. And I studied bachelor's and master's in English literature. And now I spend my whole life dedicated to serving my community. And I'm also, as I said, one of our main things is we're trying to get out the true, peaceful, logical, rational version of Islam. And we also build bridges between different faiths and religions. As I know in this podcast, I've been interviewing many rabbis and people like yourself from Israel, but people from all sides. So that's a little bit of my personal background.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gideon. Thank you so much, and I hope we can speak soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Make sure to like, comment below, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and other channels for the latest content.